Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today, we are going to talk about a specific type of cognitive behavioral therapy termed dialectical behavioral therapy. First, we're going to discuss what cognitive behavioral therapy is in general, and then what we mean by dialectical. Then we're going to discuss an overview of dialectical behavioral therapy and its types and use cases, really. So first up, what do we mean when we say cognitive behavioral therapy? So cognitive behavioral therapy is often just referred to as CBT in the psychological community, and it's based on the concept that a lot of how we feel about things in our lives is determined by what we think. And so in that way, disorders like depression or even anxiety are often believed to be the result of thoughts and beliefs or even entire belief systems that don't really serve us and that may be entirely inaccurate. And so in this form of psychotherapy, CBT is kind of a tool that helps us to correct those inaccurate beliefs and really reassign meaning and perception of someone's events and emotional states in their lives to really level them out. We refer to it as cognitive behavioral therapy because it's really made up of two main components. One is changing your thoughts, also referred to as your cognitions, and also in changing your behaviors. So when you change your thoughts, that can result in behavioral changes and vice versa. So both of these concepts are very important to get a meaningful, long-lasting change in an individual and to help them really deal with any mental health issues that they may be experiencing. They've done a lot of research on depression over the years and have found that folks with depression frequently have inaccurate beliefs about themselves or their circumstances and the world around them. There are several types of cognitive errors that tend to commonly occur in these situations. First up is personalization, which is when a person relates negative events to themselves when there is no basis for that. So like, if you're going down the street and you say hello to somebody that you know, and that person doesn't respond and they just keep on going about their day like they didn't even hear you. Some people might perceive that as a slight against them, as though that person doesn't respect them. And then that results in them feeling bad about themselves and them also feeling perhaps even rejected, depending upon the context. But that person's behavior may not have anything to do with the individual who greeted them. They might have been preoccupied thinking about something else, or been upset about an interaction with another person or something going on in the workplace. And so they just were not in a frame of mind to engage or even really hear the other person. So by considering that it's not really all about you, that perhaps other people are also in their own worlds and they have these other things going on as well. It can help you to be more likely to not drift into a negative mood or a negative mindset and self-evaluation just based on someone else's behavior. A second common cognitive error is dichotomous thinking. So by dichotomy, we just mean seeing things as one or the other, in black or white, all or none. And that is usually found when people can generate only two options in their situations or circumstances. So for example, if you're having a problem at work with a supervisor and you think that the supervisor is treating you badly, you can try to figure out how to approach this problem. If all you can come up with is that you can tell your boss off or you can resign, that is dichotomous thinking. There is generally going to be a very wide range of options in between or even beyond those options, like having a constructive conversation with the person in general, or speak with another supervisor about it, or talk to HR, depending on the severity and the specific issues that you're dealing with. But if you can only come up with two, then that dichotomous thinking is not going to generally serve you, and it can cause you to perhaps perform some self-destructive behaviors. Another cognitive error is selective abstraction. So that's when you focus only on certain aspects of your circumstances, and that's generally going to be the negative ones. So if during a meeting at work, you present a solution for a problem, and for the most part, everyone seems to really like it, but someone else points out that the budget is too high or even perhaps far too low, depending on if you are receiving grant funding and it is required to be spent in order to get more than next year. I have seen that happen in real life as well. Then if you ignore the positive components and you forget that your other coworkers really enjoyed this and you only focus on the negative comment, then you might interpret that as the people around you not really respecting you or supporting your idea, and it could lead to feelings of humiliation or embarrassment, and maybe even inadequacy by thinking that you should have considered that component. But that's not necessarily the case. It's often your coworkers and your supervisor's job to find these holes and to help you try to fill them, pointing out that there is a hole in the proposal for this solution is not necessarily a cruel thing to do. It depends on how they present it. Honesty without tact can be cruelty, but it's not necessarily rejecting your idea wholly. It's just saying, hey, maybe there's an additional better way to do this. Maybe we can build upon this idea you have together. So there is another type of cognitive error that's pretty common. It's the last one on our list today. And that one is magnification to minimization. And so that's about how folks can distort the relative importance of specific events in their lives. So if you know that you want to go to college and you have a really good college picked out or a really specific program picked out that requires high performance, and you know that your GPA is going to be utilized in the selection process, then that can be really important to you in maintaining your GPA. So if you get a failing grade in a class that is unrelated to that major, you might think that now your dream is going to be crushed because you're not going to be able to pursue your degree because you have messed up this elective class. But that's not necessarily true. A lot of times in these job interviews and in these graduate school interviews, they really care about your major coursework. They don't care about your GPA for all of those other courses. They want to know how well you're doing in the specific path that you have selected for your life. Not everyone who is going to medical school or law school is going to ace theater appreciation, and that is okay. You're not necessarily going to ace art history, or if you're going to be an art major, you may not necessarily ace biology 1 and 2, even though those are requirements for getting to the point where you can take your major courses. It's okay, you guys. It's not going to necessarily stop you from one bump in the road. And that's a reason that a lot of professors in my experience have told me that they prefer students for graduate school who are not straight A students, who've made at least 1 or 2 Bs in their lives, because those people know that sometimes you can't be perfect at everything. And so the first time that they don't make a perfect grade in graduate school, they're not going to be crushed and demoralized by it. These folks fully understand, because they're people too, that you are not going to necessarily be perfect at everything. You just need to be good at the things that you are specifically going to be using in the rest of your career path. Now, that doesn't mean don't try, but it does mean that you want to make sure you're not lapsing into these cognitive errors, like this magnification minimization issue, where you are placing more importance on a particular event than it really warrants, and then beating yourself up about it. Or you're not placing enough importance on something, and then beating yourself up about it. So cognitive behavioral therapists in this way work with folks to challenge those thinking errors and pointing out different ways to view the situation. So remember, as Obi-Wan Kenobi says, everything is true from a certain point of view. And that's really what the cognitive behavioral therapy is helping you to do, is to perceive these events from a different point of view that promotes a healthier worldview and thereby also a healthier self-image. As we discussed in our recent episode on body image and self-esteem, those two concepts are really closely tied to mental health and vice versa. We can improve how much we value ourselves by working on our mental health and our worldviews. And research over the years has shown that cognitive behavioral therapy can be as effective as medication in long-term treatments of depression. We are going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to dive into dialectical behavioral therapy and what specifically we mean by that. Stay tuned. If you're anything like me, you have had a lot of time on your hands, but also a lot of pent-up energy during the social distancing era. I wanted to use this time to really work on my branding and my logos, but I did not have any idea where to start. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd is a website with more than 750,000 designers ready to help create your perfect custom design. With designers all over the world, from Sydney to San Francisco, they're here to help ensure you get the perfect custom design every time. All you have to do is go to Design Crowd, post a brief describing the design you need, and Design Crowd invites its 750,000 designers to submit. Within hours, you'll receive your first design, and a typical project on Design Crowd receives 60 to 100 different designs from designers all around the world within 2 to 7 days. Then you just pick the design that you like best and approve the payment to the designer. Design Crowd takes a lot of the guesswork and risk, really, out of hiring freelance designers. You only have to pay for the design that you like the best. For a special $150 VIP offer for our listeners, check out designcrowd.com/health and wellness to learn more and save up to $150 when you start any project. That's DESIGNCROWD.com/health and wellness, no spaces. Or simply enter the discount code health and wellness when posting a project on Design Crowd.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Are you looking to learn more about the latest trends from the fitness world? Are you confused by all of the different trends that are out there? The GSMC Fitness Podcast is the place for you. The GSMC Fitness Podcast is the place to come for people of all skill and interest levels. Join us as we explore the latest trends in the fitness world. Does that new exercise really work? Should I try yoga? Whatever your question, chances are good you'll find an answer on the GSMC Fitness Podcast.
Introducing the concept of cognitive behavioral therapy and situations in which it can be a really useful psychotherapy, particularly in relation to mood disorders. Now we're going to dive into dialectical behavioral therapy and what that truly means as we discuss this concept related to CBT. So, a few decades ago, Dr. Marsha Linehan developed a unique approach to treating borderline personality disorder, and she referred to it as being dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. So we have found over the years in research that DBT does seem to reduce some of the worst problems associated with borderline personality disorder, and that includes repeated suicidal behaviors, therapy interfering behaviors, and so on. Some folks now refer to DBT and CBT as being kind of synonymous with each other because dialectics has been integrated quite frequently into the CBT structure. But what the heck does dialectical mean? Well, dialectics really is referring to the concept of our brain's propensity towards viewing the world in binary opposites. A lot of times these are referred to as polar opposites. But this concept that Dr. Linehan came up with and referred to as dialectical behavioral therapy is very much akin to some concepts that we discussed in my anthropology graduate classes, including the concept of binary opposition. In the 1960s, the French structural anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss coined a phrase referring to this as being good to think with. He says that binary opposites are good to think with because they help explain why we do what we do and why that ultimately matters. binary opposites by nature help us to understand a myriad of concepts. So it helps us, as we've discussed in the past, to understand concepts like warm or tepid or cool by understanding their binary opposites of being hot and cold. And so tepid and warm and cool are all in the middle of this spectrum between the boundaries of these binary opposites of hot and cold. And the objects in the middle are referred to as binary mediators. How would you explain warm or cool to someone? Well, warm is going to be somewhere between hot and cold, but closer to warm. Cool is just like that as well, except closer to cold. You need to have those boundaries in order to truly grasp and understand and explain these concepts to other people. They help you to wrap your mind around these binary mediators, the concepts that fall within the confines of these spectra. And we use this to understand everything in the world around us. It's not just sensations like hot or cold. It's also perceptions of things like color, too. What is gray? It's between black and white. What is bisexual? You guys get where I'm going with this. What is a sleeper sofa? It is somewhere between a bed and a couch. In this way, this psychological viewpoint of dialectics is very similar in concept to the anthropological perspective of the binary opposites, and also to concepts we have discussed in the past related to Jungian psychology, like the Venn diagram and the mandorlas. Remember that the mandorla is that almond shape in the middle of circles that are overlapping each other, like in the case of Venn diagrams, because mandorla means almond in Italian. So these are all different terms for really discussing very similar concepts. And we need to know light by viewing it with darkness. Its polar opposite really does help us view it in a different way. What would red mean in a world that was almost entirely red? What would inhibition mean without knowing what disinhibition means? So dialectics in that way, these binary opposites, they really help us break down the concepts of how we understand and view and appreciate and explain the world by juxtaposing them with their polar opposite. And it helps us to understand the world around it. They also often explain this in the literature as being thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, with the thesis and the antithesis being on the opposite sides of the spectrum, being the polar opposites, or the binary opposites, or the circles of the Venn diagram, and the mandorla component that overlap in your Venn diagram, or your spectrum in the middle, those binary mediator areas where black fades to gray and then to white, or vice versa. Gray is always going to be that mediator or the middle component of the spectrum, or the mandorla. And it helps us to see how things interact with each other in the world around them by understanding how things interrelate and how they are very different from each other. We can then compare and contrast and truly get a better understanding of our world around us. So what is love without understanding hate, or understanding introversion versus extroversion, or matter and antimatter, dilation and constriction? It's pervasive in our understanding of a lot of different types of language, and it helps us to understand concept and maybe even existence itself. Our world has a lot of binary opposites, at least in the way we tend to view them. What is wet without dry? what would that concept even mean to a fish who has perhaps not experienced anything other than wet? It's going to be a different experience for them than it would be perhaps for us. With dialectics, though, it's not just about viewing opposites. Opposites also seems to imply that these two items are completely different, or that they're irreconcilable, or they are even antagonistic in nature towards each other. But from ancient mysticism in the East to modern day understandings of physics, we realize that's not really the case. We know that totally opposite ideas usually do contain some elements of truth that are understood by the other side. If you've read the book The Phantom Tollbooth or seen the movie, there is one part of this storyline in which the kings of letters and of numbers, who were, I believe, brothers, if I recall correctly, do not agree on anything. And they tell the little boy Milo that they will only go ahead and get along if he can find one thing that they agree on. And they essentially think that they're tricking him. But Milo sits there and he thinks for a while, and then he says, "You agree to disagree." There are commonalities even in many seemingly opposite concepts. And Milo had found it in that concept of agreeing to disagree. It's not always as clear as it is in this case, but that always stuck with me from when I was a small child and first rented that VHS tape, telling you guys how old I am right now, from the local library, and it was one of my favorites. And then I read the book as an adult. Granted, it is a kid's book, but it's really up there for me with Alice in Wonderland, which is about mathematics. It's about logic and rationality and reason, and what worlds without those would seemingly look like to folks who do not necessarily understand the mathematics that go into it, and what it would look like if these items were really distorted. That is very similar to what the Phantom Tollbooth is like. And if you have not read the book or seen the movie, I highly recommend it. Kids and adults of all ages. I got something totally different out of it as a child than I did as an adult. In dialectical behavior therapy, psychologists use this concept of going, hey, there is usually at least a small element of truth that is going to help you understand the other side of an argument or an idea or a concept. If you dig deep enough into looking at these, a lot of things can be reconciled, like in Robert Johnson's concept of the shadow versus ego and integrating it into the full self, as he references Carl Jung. And knowing that these are actually reconcilable, at least in part, that you can slightly overlap them to obtain a mandorla, can really help folks in therapy understand where other folks are coming from and make some attempts to find an integrated middle ground, to find that mandorla in the face of conflict. The area where the conflict arises is often where we should be looking for that overlap. Now, there are some examples of when things go to opposite extremes and you get some paradoxical outcomes, and we will discuss that when we come back from this quick break. Stay tuned.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco, ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Discussing the concepts of dialectical behavioral therapy, specifically dialectics and what that means in comparison with similar concepts like Venn diagrams and their mandorla, or the concept of the shadow and the ego and the full self, or even binary opposites in anthropology. We also discussed how there is this idea that opposites are explicitly and totally opposite from each other, and that there is no element of truth representing the other side in each of these. But we find that that's often not truly the case. There are some situations, though, where you get some paradoxical outcomes. You end up with unintended outcomes or consequences. So, for example, a lot of times the best time to invest in something is when most people are afraid of doing so and advise against it. So like stocks are cheapest when the market is down and you're not seeing an immediate return, but this is a long-term investment. So depending on the actual type of investment you're looking into, it may be a good idea to do it when the market is down. Now, granted, I am not an economist. Do not take that as direct advice to go out and start buying things right now or investing in things. Definitely speak with someone who is focused in economics and investments. But this is just a general concept. There's also the concept that the more you focus on the needs of other people, the less you'll have to draw from to meet their needs. So you can't pour from an empty cup is really what that means. If you're not spending some time on yourself and making sure that you are taking care of you, that you are investing in self-care, then you're not going to be able to really help these other people you want to help. If you rebel against people that you love, that's actually a form of allowing them to control you. And that concept is something that I've learned really as I've gotten older, and I've been working to be a kinder, gentler Alex, as we have discussed in the past. So it's really this concept that by letting people's actions around you form you in a way that makes you hard to the world that makes you go, okay, I can't trust anyone because of these experiences, then really you're letting those individuals and those experiences shape you. And it's not really jabbing back at the world around you. The best thing that I think personally you can do in those situations is to still be loving and kind and open to others. You don't have to open yourself up so much that you're guaranteed to get hurt each time, but you can refuse to let bad experiences close you off and make you hard against the world, because it's really going to get you the opposite outcome for what you wanted. By becoming hard, it's really letting them control you. The more you argue for a concept, the less likely you are to be heard. So the more you argue for a certain thing to happen at work or within your relationship, and the way that you argue about it may make you less likely to really be listened to. The more that you feel drawn to a person, the more you feel like you really want to be with them, the less likely, a lot of times, they'll end up wanting you back. That one is a rough one to learn, you guys, but it is just how humans are. We would like for humans to just be these rational, logical creatures, at least I would, where you can have these very real conversations with them. But a lot of times it's almost like breaking the fourth wall. And that's why people are uncomfortable if folks tell them that they love them too early or are really paying them a lot of attention. They want the people who aren't paying them attention. It's very strange. I'm not sure what that evolutionarily would have done for us as an adaptive response, but that does not mean that it is maladaptive necessarily. It just means that I personally don't understand it and I don't like it. And that means that it is therefore an area of personal growth for me to invest in trying to figure that out. We also find that as we make new medical advances, a lot of these make it even harder to treat diseases. So as we are making more antibiotics and learning more about specific types of antibiotics, we are also getting antibiotic-resistant bugs. That is just how it works. Sometimes it's paradoxical. Now, those are real-world examples from our personal lives, from the lives around us, what generally happens. But that can also be true of our internal worlds, our self-views. So some therapists refer to those as our schemas. So we may see that there are seemingly completely opposite perspectives, and they often end up yielding really similar, albeit poor outcomes. So some folks feel unworthy of having their needs met, and others feel very entitled to having their needs met. And both of those approaches often result in other people not wanting to meet those people's needs. Some folks are anxious of attaching to others because they may feel inferior, and others avoid attachments out of a sense of superiority rather than inferiority. And those folks generally end up with unfulfilling, estranged relationships. People who tend to blame others either often feel blameworthy at all times, or they feel like they are never to blame. Whether you are overly dependent on other people around you, or whether you are so independent that you never really ask for help, either way, a lot of times you may have trouble getting help when you actually need it. Humans are strange, contradictory creatures, but by studying dialectics and binary opposition, it can really help you to kind of reconcile these extreme opposite views of the self and others and the world around you, and see how having these types of approaches where you're too far into the extreme could really cause you to have damaging feelings or damage your relationships or even your own health. And it can just create overall unhappiness as well, by having these unrealistic expectations of yourself or of others, whether you're over-relying on others or over-relying on yourself. You can have these unrealistic expectations, and that can lead to an overall sense of dissatisfaction by believing that only others can do this for you or only you can do this for you. And when either the others or yourself fail, you are going to be deeply gutted by that because it's black and white thinking. We want to make sure that we are moving more towards viewing things in shades of gray. Now that gray can be dove gray or it can be charcoal. It doesn't necessarily have to be perfectly in the middle of gray. But by being able to see all of the gray through dialectical behavior therapy, it can really help you find integrated middle ground perspectives that are very healthy. So we can also note that one of Freud's best contributions to conceptualization in psychopathology is perhaps his understanding of how dialectics work in humans. We are unaware of it frequently as to the specific terminology, but a lot of his concepts of the id, the ego, and superego are related to their dialectical relationships over the control of your impulses, or not having enough control of your impulses, and finding a way to find that moderate, integrated control, that temperate middle ground, which is the ego, whereas the id and your superego are at these extremes. It's very similar in concept too to Carl Jung's self being your middle ground versus the ego, the parts of yourself you embrace, and your shadow, the parts that you repress, whether they be noble or whether they be dark in nature. So we see a lot of elements of dialectics in a ton of different psychotherapeutic strategies today, as I've just discussed with Freud and Jung. But up next, we are going to discuss dialectical behavioral therapy specifically, now that we understand what the nature of dialectics truly means. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to dive into dialectical behavior therapy. Stay tuned. If you're looking to rebrand or reinvent your business, Design Crowd may be right for you. Design Crowd is a website that helps entrepreneurs, startups, and small businesses, from dentists and accountants to photographers and personal trainers, outsource or really crowdsource your custom logos, business cards, and web designs from over 750,000 designers around the world. From Sydney to San Francisco, the designers with Design Crowd are there to help you with awesome creative ideas and make sure you get the perfect custom design every time. All you have to do is go to Design Crowd, post a brief describing the design you need, and Design Crowd will invite all of their 750,000 globally distributed designers to submit to you. Within hours, you'll receive your first design, and over the course of 2 to 7 days, a typical project receives 60 to over 100 different designs on Design Crowd. Then, you just pick the one you like the best and approve payment to the designer. Harvard Business School's Innovation Forum has also used Design Crowd to make them a logo. They received over 267 logo designs from 57 designers around the world. But you don't have to be Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd. You can start a project on Design Crowd from just $99 today. For a special $150 VIP offer for our listeners, you can also check out designcrowd.com/health and wellness to learn more and save up to $150 when you start any project. That's DESIGNCROWD.com/health and wellness, no spaces. Or simply enter the discount code health and wellness when posting a project on Design Crowd. Get your perfect design today.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Back before the break, we were talking about what dialectics truly means. Now that we have an understanding of that, we're going to discuss dialectical behavior therapy specifically. Dialectical behavior therapy is a specific type of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. And as we discussed earlier, it was developed in the 80s by Dr. Marsha M. Linehan to help treat borderline personality disorder. And since then, its use has been expanded to many different types of mental health disorders. So what is DBT? It's a type of psychotherapy, which is also referred to as talk therapy, that utilizes that cognitive behavioral approach. And DBT emphasizes the psychosocial aspects of treatment. So in this approach, some people tend to be more prone to react in an intense and even out of the ordinary manner towards different emotional situations, especially those that are in romantic, family, or friendly relationships. So in those cases, DBT theory suggests that some folks' arousal levels in those situations increase far more quickly than the average person's. So they get to a higher level of emotional stimulation, and they do so in a much quicker time span than the average person tends to. And it also takes them a lot longer to return to those baseline levels. So folks who are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder often experience extreme swings in their emotions. They tend to see the world in black and white and are always focusing on one crisis before moving on to another crisis. Just kind of crisis hopping. And it's difficult for a lot of people to understand those reactions. And most of all, their own family and childhood reactions may have emphasized invalidating those reactions. So that leaves them without any mechanisms for coping with these emotional surges. DBT is a process or a method to teach them those skills that will help them with coping and processing those emotions. There are a few different components of DBT. First up is support-oriented. So in support-oriented components of DBT, you're really helping a person identify their strengths and to embrace them and build upon them so that they can feel better about themselves and their lives. It's helping with their self-esteem and their self-image. In the cognitive-based component, DBT helps pinpoint the thoughts and beliefs and assumptions that are making their lives harder. So like the concept of being a perfectionist and thinking you truly have to be perfect at everything or else all is lost. Or if you get angry at all, that you're a bad person. And it helps people to look at this from a different perspective and to think of their lives in a different way to make their lives easier. So it helps folks to understand that you don't need to be perfect at things for people to care about you. And you don't need to be perfect to be good enough, to be worthy, and to be valued at all. And that everyone gets angry. Emotions are normal and everyone experiences those. So if you have a bout of anger, it's more about how you are reacting to that anger, how you are processing or releasing that anger, than just about experiencing anger in and of itself. Anger is normal, and that's okay. And that's what the cognitive-based approach is really helping with. You also have the collaborative component of dialectical behavior therapy, and that is something that focuses on constant attention to relationships between the clients who are experiencing these problematic thought processes and the staff who are working with them. So in DBT, the folks who are the clients who are undergoing this therapy are encouraged to work out problems in their personal relationships or their professional relationships with their therapist, and the therapist does the same with them. So in DBT, folks complete homework assignments, and a lot of those are regarding role-playing new ways of interacting with other folks and practicing new skills like self-soothing when you are upset. An example of this might be that if you're someone who apologizes frequently because you have a low concept of your self-esteem or your self-worth or even your body image, and you're constantly apologizing because you don't feel good enough, one way that you may approach that instead is that when people are patient with you, that you instead thank them and you say, "Thank you for being patient with me," or "Thank you for understanding," rather than going into a spiral of apologizing. And you're practicing these in role play because it's difficult to just change these behaviors. And trying to do it on your own in the moment can be very difficult. Truly, it's hard to remember to do those things. You're changing an entire way of thinking and of behaving. It's your way of life at this point. And so in these role-playing interactions, you're really doing some intentional construction of the world around you. You are working to get rid of these unhealthy types of responses and replace them with really healthy ones. And by role-playing, you are getting these into your vocabulary. You're getting accustomed to these reactions as well. And it helps them to come about more naturally and easily for you in real interactions one-on-one with your friends or your family members or your coworkers or anyone else who is a loved one of yours, like a romantic partner. So by helping you with these issues of self-soothing and also role-playing new ways of interacting with others, these skills form an integral part of dialectical behavior therapy, and they're taught in weekly lectures or practiced in weekly homework groups, and they're referred to in many different DBT groups. Individual therapists help the people to learn, apply, and truly master their dialectical behavior therapy skills. This is really important for individuals who feel like they may not have a support system or they may need to work on valuing themselves. There are many different reasons that one may need DBT or that one may benefit from DBT, but it can also just be really helpful in reorienting who you are as a person. Although this was initially created for borderline personality disorder, if you're depressed, this can also be very helpful. Or if you're just wanting to adjust your self-image, even if you feel that you don't qualify as being in an episode of major depression, it can really help to reframe your life. So I use the specific example of apologizing because I used to do that a lot. I would be late to things a lot, and I would say, "I'm so sorry for this," and folks would be like, it's fine. And I was clearly overreacting when I should have just been able to believe in myself and that my friends aren't going to hate me because I'm 10 minutes late to a party, even though I am the first person there. That's not something that they really care about when it comes to caring about me as a person and my value and my worth to them. So instead, I thank them for their patience. And now we can have more complex conversations about those issues. Also, by becoming more confident in that way and readjusting the way that I think, I'm not generally late to those interactions anymore. And that's because I am able to go ahead and not be stressed about it. Everyone is different in that regard. And I encourage my friends who apologize frequently to just think about it from a different perspective as well. And that doesn't mean that every time they apologize to me, I harp on them. That can be actually detrimental and paradoxical, as we discussed in a previous segment. So you may be trying to elicit one type of response, but you're going to get the exact opposite outcome by being too rough on them. If you tell them to stop apologizing, they'll frequently apologize for apologizing too much because they're kind of caught in this loop. And that's where that role playing with the therapist really comes in. But as their friend, the best thing that you can do is be understanding and just try to be sympathetic and there for them in those situations. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about group versus individual dialectical behavior therapy. Stay tuned.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing dialectical behavior therapy and its main components of support-oriented, cognitive-based, and collaborative components. Now we're going to talk about individual weekly psychotherapy sessions and the weekly group therapy sessions. So these are the two main types, or the two main ways that DBT may be approached. And in the individual psychotherapy sessions, they tend to occur on a weekly basis, and they emphasize helping the individual problem solve for the issues they've experienced in the past week and any troubles that have arisen in the client's life. If they were having trouble with thinking about harming themselves or suicidal behavior, those take first priority. And then they address any behaviors that might interfere with the therapy process. It's not just the extremes, though, that are discussed. They really also go over the quality of life issues and help these folks to work towards improving life in general. Having these open discussions is really helping the individual not only reframe their experiences, but also to take an active part in their treatment plan. And that's really one of the strengths of psychotherapy. It allows you to be involved in that process in a very integrated way. And in that way, it can also in turn be very empowering and increase your confidence and your self-esteem. And thereby, as we've discussed in the past, also your mental health, because this is also truly holistic. So when they're focusing on these different issues, we also talk about quality of life and trying to improve life in general. And these individual discussions focus on also decreasing or just processing and dealing with post-traumatic stress responses, largely from previous trauma in the person's life. So it may not just be things that bothered them in the past week, but also unresolved trauma that hasn't truly been dealt with, and they're still receiving these triggering responses to. And it can help enhance their self-respect and their self-image by empowering them to deal with and even decrease these episodes or the severity of their responses. In between and during these sessions, though, the psychotherapist may teach and reinforce certain types of adaptive behaviors, especially those that are related to the therapeutic relationship. They can teach patients how to manage emotional trauma and process it, rather than just reducing it or trying to remove them from that crisis. They also may warrant some telephone contact and phone contact in between sessions with the individual therapist is typically part of the DBT process. So during these individual therapy sessions, the therapist and the client are really working towards learning and improving a lot of what many folks may consider to be basic social skills. You also have these weekly group therapy sessions, though. These are typically about 2.5 hours per session, and they're led by trained dialectical behavior therapy therapists. And in those groups, folks learn skills from one of 4 different modules related to DBT. One of those is interpersonal effectiveness. The second is distress tolerance or reality acceptance skills, emotional regulation, and also mindfulness skills. So we've talked about some of these concepts before in previous podcasts, and really we're starting at this point to truly build upon these previous concepts to give us a holistic view of how everything is interrelated. Mindfulness is something that's really popular in the zeitgeist regarding just feeling better in general, being present in the moment, improving your mood and your outlook, or even your sleep. But it can also be very helpful if you are experiencing depression or BPD or a myriad of other types of mood, eating disorders, or even substance use disorders. We're going to talk a little bit about those modules now. So first up, the easiest one I think to discuss is mindfulness. We have discussed this in depth previously and should be pretty familiar to our longtime listeners. So the essential part of all of the skills taught in the group sessions are really core mindfulness skills. They teach folks to observe and describe and participate instead of just reacting, particularly in those emotional ways. So it's really promoting some analytical thinking and observation. They call these the core mindfulness what skills. And they answer the question, what do I do to practice core mindfulness skills? It teaches you to be non-judgmental and to be effective and to be one-minded in it. To be one-mindfully is how they refer to it. So it's helping with a healthy sense of observation and focus, as well as description and participation. Up next is interpersonal effectiveness, and that's how you respond or interact with the people around you in your personal relationships. As we discussed earlier, those personal relationships, especially those of friends and family and romantic partners, can be some of the most difficult for folks who have BPD specifically, borderline personality disorder specifically. So in DBT skill training, they have a lot of similarities to those that are taught in assertiveness or interpersonal problem-solving classes. And that can really include skills that increase your effectiveness for asking for what you need, or in asserting yourself in saying no, or learning to cope with interpersonal conflicts which are inevitable. Because remember that avoidance is not truly a healthy coping mechanism. It's important for folks to learn to say no or to let someone down gently, but while still saying exactly what they mean. So there's no room for equivocation. It reminds me of the concept that there are many things that are useful in everyday life that we don't learn in school. And it reminds me of the Neil Gaiman quote, where he says, "I've been making a list of the things they don't teach you at school. They don't teach you how to love somebody. They don't teach you how to be famous. They don't teach you how to be rich or how to be poor. They don't teach you how to walk away from someone you don't love any longer. They don't teach you how to know what's going on in someone else's mind. They don't teach you what to say to someone who's dying. They don't teach you anything worth knowing." While I disagree that you don't learn anything worth knowing in school or that you aren't taught anything worth knowing, the rest of the quote really resonates with me. We don't learn a lot of these interpersonal skills. We're relying on those to be modeled and implicitly picked up instead of explicitly being taught them. And it's these psychosocial skills that we're really learning more about in that interpersonal effectiveness training within DBT. How to say no when you really don't have time for something or you don't want to do something instead of overextending yourself. And in that way, you can make sure that your cup is full so that you can pour it out to others when they truly do need you and you're able to give more of yourself. It helps you to learn how to tell someone that you're not interested in continuing a relationship with them without hurting them or without harming yourself or harming both of you by staying in something longer than either of you truly should, or by hurting someone by just avoiding the conversation completely and leaving them confused. Y'all know from previous episodes that I think that ghosting is a real disservice to both people in the relationship. It is a lack of assertiveness and a lot of avoidance of the issues. And it also really deprives people of closure. It leaves wounds that are totally unnecessary. And while some of my friends say, I don't owe that person anything, I like to think of it from the other perspective of, does that person deserve to have to go around the rest of their life and wonder what happened and what they did wrong? Is that kind? No. And so I tend to select towards kindness. But we truly don't learn these psychosocial skills. We don't learn how to love someone in a healthy way. We don't learn how to be famous, how to interact with people when you're famous, or how to walk away from people you don't love anymore, because you may still have love for them, but it may not be in that romantic way. And a lot of times we hurt ourselves as well as others when we don't understand how to do these things or how to wrap our heads around them. And I think that in that way, dialectical behavior therapy can be very useful to many individuals, not even those who are necessarily experiencing mental health concerns, but truly for folks who are just trying to navigate the world around them. I honestly think that the world around us would be a lot healthier and the individuals within it a lot mentally healthier and happier if we were all able to have more straightforward discourse and learn more of these interpersonal effectiveness skills. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to wrap up these modules of interpersonal effectiveness, distress tolerance, and emotion regulation, and talk about the positive improvements seen in patients who have undergone DBT, according to studies by the American Psychiatric Association. Stay tuned.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing individual versus group therapy sessions for dialectical behavior therapy, as well as 2 of the 4 modules of dialectical behavior therapy. So these are the skills training sessions that are really helping folks to reframe their perspective and reshape their lives. So in our last segment, we discussed mindfulness and we introduced the topic of interpersonal effectiveness, how it addresses those issues that Neil Gaiman so eloquently listed out for us in The Kindly Ones, the things that they don't teach you how to do growing up, how you aren't taught how to walk away from someone you don't love any longer, or how to love someone, or how to be famous, or be rich, or poor, or figure out what other folks are thinking, and even what to say to someone who is dying. And in my personal experience, I've seen that happen a lot with people I know, in which they get some type of terrible illness, or even a terminal illness, and all the folks who truly do love them and want to be there for them definitely don't know what to say. And that results in folks oftentimes saying nothing at all. So this dialectical behavioral therapy, especially this psychosocial component of learning interpersonal effectiveness skills, is very important. Remember that this type of therapy was initially created with folks who had borderline personality disorder in mind. And people who do have BPD frequently have good interpersonal skills. However, they may struggle in varying degrees to apply those skills in specific contexts. So for example, if it's an emotionally powerful situation, whether that's through vulnerability or volatility, anyone may be able to describe effective behavioral sequences when you're really thinking about someone else encountering a problem, but you may yourself be incapable of generating or carrying out that similar set of behaviors when really holding up a mirror and working on your own personal situations. It's like the concept of those who can't do, teach. Now, I do not necessarily fully agree with that, but as in many things, there's a little bit of truth to that, especially if we view it in reverse and say that sometimes folks who are good teachers or good advice givers or good life coaches may still struggle with their own lives with these same situations they're helping others with. And that is because proximity can be blinding. And it's different when you're looking at someone else's problem and you're not emotionally invested or emotionally aroused or emotionally involved. But when you have to deal with it yourself and you're in a position of emotional vulnerability, or you are having an emotionally contentious interaction with another person, that's very different. Your context has changed and the circumstances have changed. And indeed, you are now the one in that position instead of the person you have been advising before now. That's totally normal. That's why a lot of therapists also go to see therapists. They have all of the education to go ahead and help other people with these issues. But when it comes to their own, they understand that it is best to go see another therapist. That is very normal. So when we think about this, This particular module of interpersonal effectiveness is focusing on situations where you're trying to change something, like you're requesting that someone do something either with you or for you, or to resist changes when someone else is trying to make them in you or in your surroundings, learning how to assertively say no. And remember that assertiveness is not the same as aggressiveness. Aggression and assertiveness are not the same thing. You can be assertive and still be kind. Assertiveness is really just demarcating your boundaries in a very clear manner. You can be both loving and kind and have your boundaries maintained. These skills are really meant to maximize the likelihood that your personal goals in a specific situation, the outcome or the objective that you desire, will be met while also not damaging the relationship with the other person or either person's self-respect. We're also going to talk about stress tolerance. Stress tolerance is the third module, and many approaches to mental health treatment focus on adjusting to stressing events and circumstances. But a lot of times, folks are looking at just changing those things rather than learning how to accept them or find meaning for them or even tolerating that distress. Remember, when it comes to certain types of problems, emotion-focused coping might be a better option than problem-focused coping. Although problem-focused coping, which would be changing these events and circumstances, tends to be the better go-to, the healthier one, some situations cannot be changed by an individual through problem-focused coping. So emotion-focused coping is going to be the healthier option, even though it may feel like a more passive option. So in situations like if you have a loved one with a terminal illness, you can't change that. And so emotion-focused coping may help you more. So it can help you with your stress tolerance and learning to accept the inevitable. These tasks have generally been tackled by a lot of folks in the religious and spiritual communities. And dialectical behavior therapy does emphasize learning to bear pain in a skillful manner. So we've talked about stress inoculation in the past, and that's really what this distress tolerance is really looking to do. It's a natural extension of the mindfulness skills that we discussed as being part of the first module. It helps you to accept the circumstances and reality that you face in a way that is not placing value or judgment on yourself or others or even the situation itself. It is helping you to really be non-judgmental. And that doesn't mean that you approve of the situation. It doesn't mean that you want your loved one to die. Acceptance of reality is not the same as approving of that reality, but it's helping you to accept that this is a thing that is happening or that is going to happen, and I may not be able to change that. And indeed, in many cases, we are not able to change it, but it is helping us to accept what's going on so that it causes us less distress. It allows us to practice more mindfulness and take advantage of really utilizing and experiencing those moments that we do have still available with joy. And I'm not saying that sorrow is not natural and that anger is not natural. They very much are, especially when you are dealing with having a loved one who has a terminal illness. And it can be very difficult for many different people. But learning distress tolerance can help you out with that, and it can help you make the most of the opportunities that you have, the time that you have. And it doesn't just have to be related to terminal illness. That's just a specific type of example that's relevant in my personal life and that I think is relevant to a lot of folks. It's something that's kind of easily understandable as being something that we can't truly change. And in that way, I think it's one of the easiest illustrations of emotion-focused coping and how mindfulness and distress tolerance can really help us
in those types of situations. Distress tolerance behaviors are really focusing on tolerating and surviving crises and accepting life as it is in the moment. That doesn't have to mean that you're happy about it. It just means that you can experience it without having to go down with the ship. There are 4 sets of crisis survival strategies that they teach in the distress tolerance component of DBT, and those are distracting, self-soothing, improving the moment, and considering your pros and cons. And the acceptance skills that are promoted in this approach include radical acceptance, turning your mind towards acceptance, and willingness versus willfulness. You guys know I'm a big fan of the etymology of words. I'm very interested in where these words come from and what they specifically mean, their nuanced meanings. And willingness and willfulness are 2 different things. One is that you're down to try it, and the other is that more or less you are gung-ho to do this thing. You're definitely doing it. So for me, that's one of the easiest ways to think of willingness and willfulness. So it means that you're trying rather than just going headlong into something. And that type of therapy and this specific component can really help teach that. Lastly, we have emotion regulation. So folks who have BPD or who may otherwise be suicidal or have typically emotionally intense reactions, they might be very angry or intensely frustrated or deeply depressed or wildly anxious. And this type of emotion regulation and DBT can help with that. It really is suggesting that folks who are grappling with those kind of concerns might benefit in learning how to regulate their emotion to some degree. And there are a couple of different skills for emotion regulation within the realm of dialectical behavior therapy. And those include learning to properly identify and correctly label your emotions, identifying any obstacles to adjusting or changing those emotions, applying distress tolerance techniques, taking opposite action, increasing your positive emotional events or your mindfulness to current emotions, and also reducing your vulnerability to getting sucked into an emotional mindset, also referred to as emotion mind, where you're only feeling and you're not really thinking. And so you get caught up in this positive feedback loop of emotions that aren't truly healthy. In this way, dialectical behavior therapy can be very helpful for emotional wellness in general, as well as mental health and wellness. And as we discussed before, your mental health and wellness and your emotional health and wellness are involved in this large feedback loop with your physical health and wellness and your body image and your self-esteem and how you value yourself and indeed how you see the world around you. So I think that many different people, even those not impacted personally by mental illness or mental health disorders, could really benefit from dialectical behavior therapy. And indeed, the American Psychiatric Association has endorsed DBT as effective in treating borderline personality disorder, but patients who undergo DBT have also seen improvements in lowering the frequency of suicidal behavior, as well as lowering the severity of that behavior. They've seen it result in shorter hospitalizations, decreased anger, a decreased likelihood of dropping out of treatment, otherwise thought of as an increase in medical compliance, which is really the degree to which a patient is correctly following medical advice. A lot of times that refers to drug compliance or medication compliance, but it can also mean medical device usage, self-care, therapy sessions like your DBT practices, or even self-directed exercises. It can also overall improve social functioning. So in this way, I think it can help out a lot of people. If you ever feel super awkward like I do, you may benefit from dialectical behavior therapy and reframing your approach to the world. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Health and Wellness Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.